Lecture 16, on Ethics, Contemporary Moral Problems. Eating Animals, Applied Ethics 8. Our text opens with a claim from Leo Tolstoy that, a man can live and be healthy without killing animals for food, therefore, if he eats meat, he participates in taking animal life merely for the sake of his appetite. And to act so is immoral. Indeed, many people feel this way today, advocating for animal rights, promoting vegetarian and vegan diets, and so on. This will be one of the central ideas analyzed in this chapter. 1. Eating Animals, an Introduction. Our text opens with an interesting observation, namely, the British, which our text is, and many other nations have a strange relationship with animals. Our text illustrates this strange relationship with an anecdote about their pet chickens. They feed and nurture their pet chickens daily, and yet they will enjoy a chicken dinner, suggesting that they are not at all concerned with the well-being of chickens in general. This is something our text has in common with many of us. They point out that a slim percentage of people in the UK are vegetarians, yet a large percentage of people purport to be animal lovers, despite being meat eaters. It is not difficult to reconcile this by distinguishing between which animals you will eat and which you will not, but it may be difficult to explain why this discrimination is justified, and, more difficult still, why is it morally acceptable to eat some animals rather than others? This moral acceptability to eat animals will be the focal point of this chapter. 2. Justifying meat eating. Our text has us consider two justifications for the moral permissibility of meat eating. The first considered is what our text calls the comparative justification. This justification is unsophisticated and works as follows: there are no moral objections to animals eating other animals in nature, so why would there be an objection to humans eating meat also? For one, as we've discussed previously, animals are considered immoral, that is, their actions cannot be considered moral or immoral because they cannot grasp concepts of morality. Therefore, this justification is quite weak. The second justification will be substantially stronger than the first if you are a believer in one of the Abrahamic religious traditions, such as Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Our text provides biblical references to God's permissibility of meat eating. However, as an atheist or member of another religion, such as Buddhism in some cases, why would this justification have any authoritative persuasive power? Indeed, appealing to Scripture to grant moral permissibility to meat eating will be ineffective in a secular setting with an audience of non-believers. Therefore, we need to examine meat eating through other ethical lenses than religious ones that only provide persuasive guidance to followers of those religions. 3. Act Utilitarianism. Our text returns, in this section, to Jeremy Bentham's Act Utilitarian Ethical Lens. Recall that, on this view, persons' individual acts are only morally good if they provide the greatest good, in terms of pleasure, for the greatest number of people. However, recall further that, since this view is grounded in avoiding pains and pursuing pleasures, we could argue, as Bentham seems to, that since animals avoid pain and pursue pleasure as well, then we ought to consider their pains and pleasures in our moral calculus. Indeed, as our text points out, it would be as arbitrary to disregard the pains of people based on race, sex, or gender as it would be to disregard pains based on species. Therefore, the utilitarian maxim could perhaps be rephrased to include animals. Thus, an act is good when it provides the greatest pleasure to the greatest number of sentient beings. With this formulation, we can argue that it is only morally permissible to eat meat when any pain experienced by the animal is greatly outweighed by the overall pleasure it produces. So, on the act utilitarian view, there is room for condemning meat eating in some situations, but it cannot say that meat eating, in itself, is always morally wrong. As usual, for the utilitarian, the answer is, it depends. For challenges to Bentham, one objection to Bentham's allowing for the moral permissibility of meat eating in some circumstances that may be motivated by species chauvinism, is the challenge that a moral distinction between humans and animals is not merely arbitrary. Furthermore, it could be claimed that speciesist distinctions are not the same discriminatory thought processes as racism and sexism, since humans are capable of higher-order pleasures, thought, and experience. This objection is also sometimes framed in terms of species-typical interests. For example, humans and animals have species-typical interests in avoiding pain, therefore, causing pain to humans and animals is morally impermissible. However, humans have the cognitive ability to mentally project themselves into the future, and emotions like desires for the future, giving them a species-typical interest in continued existence. Contrarily, animals do not seem to have these cognitive abilities and therefore cannot have the same species-typical interest in continued existence, only the avoidance of pain. The conclusion that is supposed to follow from this reasoning is that, while we have moral obligations not to harm animals, there is no moral obligation not to eat meat so long as the animals are slaughtered humanely. However, our text warns us against similar lines of reasoning, since basing the moral permissibility of killing on cognitive, or rational, abilities can lead to some troubling theoretical consequences. For example, consider an elderly patient suffering from dementia. Would killing this patient be morally permissible if their cognitive abilities were sufficiently degraded? How about newborns? Are they as cognitively capable as grown apes? Indeed, similar lines of reasoning are used to grant the moral permissibility of abortion. To salvage this argument for the moral permissibility of humanely killing animals for eating, some will appeal to potentiality arguments. For example, babies have the potential for greater rational abilities as they age, and patients with dementia may be cured pending advancements in medical science. Therefore, this potential is supposed to retain the moral acceptability of the speciesist distinction. However, Peter Singer argues against this line of reasoning with an argument by analogy. With King Charles III now on the throne, Prince William is now next in line. Since Prince William is only a potential king, he only has the rights of a prince, not the rights of a king. He will only earn kingly rights if he actually becomes king someday. Analogously, the baby and the patient with dementia are only potentially more rational than some animals, but they won't warrant the extra moral considerations until that potential is realized. Therefore, justifying moral distinctions between humans and animals based on rationality or cognitive abilities can lead to counterintuitive consequences. 5. Utilitarian reasons for eating animals. Despite what may seem to be the case after reading Singer's arguments in the previous section, Singer actually agrees with Bentham that eating meat can be morally defensible. However, it can only be defensible if the meat is a product of careful and humane slaughter, and the life provided to the animals leading up to their slaughter was better than a life in nature where they may likely have died a vicious death at the teeth of a natural predator. Therefore, Singer is wholeheartedly opposed to factory farms, where animals are kept in cramped, unsanitary conditions and slaughtered with no regard for minimizing their pain. As Singer says, these arguments, relating to the moral relevance of pains afflicting animals, apply to animals who have been reared in factory farms, which means that we should not eat chicken, pork or veal, unless we know that the meat we are eating was not produced by factory farm methods. Indeed, if we think back to our use of this example in Lecture 3, we can see that animals reared in factory farms could not be said to be flourishing, from the Aristotelian perspective. Since preference utilitarians, like Singer, see this the same way, they would likely conclude that if the animals were free-range, cared for, fed well, and painlessly slaughtered, then stopping their continued existence may not be immoral, since it is very unlikely that they have the mental capacity to have distant future preferences that will go unfulfilled if their lives are cut short. As a segue into the next section, our text acknowledges the omission of Mill's rule utilitarianism. This is because our text encourages us to think back to Lecture 2 and apply the general objections covered there to the utilitarian arguments for and against meat eating. Furthermore, with what has been said in this chapter, along with Lecture 2, our text also encourages us to apply Mill's rule utilitarianism to this issue for ourselves. Our text leaves this section with 3 questions for us to consider in our moral deliberations. 1. Is meat eating a higher or lower pleasure? Does it make a difference if lamb is consumed in a greasy spoon cafe, or if it is prepared by a world-renowned chef? Should the moral acceptability of eating an animal turn on the way in which an animal is prepared for consumption? 2. Are animals worth less than humans because they cannot access higher pleasures? 3. Would an outright ban on factory farming be a rule that, if universalized, would lead to the greatest good for the greatest number? What other rules might be advocated by a rule utilitarian in this applied ethical setting? If we answer these questions with this chapter and chapter 1 in mind, then we should leave this section with a solid grasp of utilitarian thinking in this area. Though it is not entertained in our text, an interesting perspective on meat eating is provided by Sokolo, the leader of a Hadzabe tribe, one of the last true hunter-gatherer tribes living by Lake Eyasi in Tanzania. The tribe, dressed in loincloths and wielding spears for hunting and protection, provided adventurer Mike Corey with unique primal insights regarding meat eating and life in general. The first question Corey asked Sokolo was, "What is the most important thing in life?" Sokolo's answer was manako. Manako, in Hadzabe, means meat. 6. Kantian Ethics and Eating Animals. Our text has us recall that Kant regards humans as not having any direct duty to animals. He says that a human being is a being altogether different in rank and dignity from things, such as irrational animals, with which one may deal and dispose at one's discretion. Therefore, we can kill and eat animals all we want, and, in so doing, there is no moral bearing on our behavior. 4. If we analyze meat eating in light of the categorical imperative, the maxim, everyone can eat meat if they are hungry, doesn't seem to lead to a contradiction, and in eating meat, we don't seem to be using any humans as mere means to ends. However, this does not mean Kant would find animal cruelty morally acceptable. Indeed, he does believe we have an indirect duty not to abuse animals. That is, according to Kant, we should not be cruel to animals because those who do are likely to develop abusive dispositions toward humans also. Since factory farms constitute cruel behavior toward animals, Kant and the utilitarians, interestingly, find themselves with the same position regarding the treatment of animals and the morality of meat eating. Our text concludes this section with the interesting observation that contemporary Kantians like Christine Korsgaard disagree that we have no direct duties toward animals. Korsgaard disagrees with Kant that it is morally permissible to treat pain experience in creatures merely as means to ends, since it is a pain to be in pain. And that is not a trivial fact. Therefore, as our text notes, it may be an open question as to whether Kantians should allow for direct duties to animals, even though Kant did not himself. 7. Virtue ethics and eating animals. Aristotelian virtue ethics, as pointed out by our text, is an agent-centered theory, so it does not always provide immediate guidance on individual actions. Indeed, our initial question as virtue ethicists is one of disposition, or character, assessment. The question then, in this situation, would be, would I be virtuous, wise, temperate, etc., if I eat meat? Our motivations are also operative in this process, leading to an answer of what action would be the virtuous one. Am I going to eat this meat because I have developed a habit of giving in to my desire for a juicy ribeye steak every time I get hungry? If so, then I am suffering from a vice of excess, namely gluttony. If I have developed an ascetic habit of only eating minimally nutritious food only to the point of maintaining my life, this would be a vice of deficiency. However, if I develop a habit of eating a balanced diet, leading to optimum health, then my act of eating chicken, brown rice, and vegetables is a virtuous act, in line with the virtue of temperance. As described in our text, Rosalind Hursthouse approaches this moral issue using virtue ethics from a different angle. Hursthouse argues that the example Singer uses to expose immoral instances of meat eating, namely, eating meat from factory farms, is evidence of a vicious lack of compassion or willful ignorance, since many of us are aware of the poor conditions animals face in factory farms. Indeed, purchasing factory farm meat from either of these dispositions would communicate vices of deficiency. Therefore, eating meat will be morally permissible if we are conscientious about the sources of our food and we eat them in the right amounts, at the right times, and for the right reasons. Our text again would have us revisit the chapter on virtue ethics and attempt to answer the following questions from a virtue ethicist perspective. 1. Who are the virtuous role models from whom we can learn when it comes to eating animals? TV chefs, who speak of doing justice to the animal when cooking it. Vegetarian campaigners? Peter Singer? 2. TV presenters such as Bear Grylls and Ed Stafford are often dropped into inhospitable locations for our entertainment and can only survive by killing animals for food. Does their killing reflect a virtue or a vice? 3. Angela is a vegetarian who is eating with a friend at a highly expensive restaurant. Angela's friend has paid for dinner and has chosen the courses to eat. One dish involves the eating of carefully prepared duck. Would it be virtuous for Angela to eat the duck, or to stand by her beliefs even in an extreme situation? It is worth researching Singer's idea of the Paris exemption to develop your answer. Again, as with the utilitarian questions posed by our text earlier, if we can answer these questions from the Aristotelian perspective, then we should become more confident in our ability to analyze issues surrounding eating animals using the virtue ethics moral lens. 8. Cora Diamond. As I am unfamiliar with Cora Diamond's work, I will defer to our text's analysis of her ideas almost verbatim. To conclude this chapter, we will briefly reflect on the ideas of Cora Diamond, who offers a perspective on the ethical acceptability of eating animals that stands apart from the normative ethical theory-based views hitherto discussed. Much of the focus in this chapter has been on the question of whether animals are morally relevant, or whether they have rights to the same degree as humans when it comes to considering the ethical acceptability of consuming them. Diamond objects to this approach entirely and does not seek to criticize the morality of eating animals via talk of moral rights. She has a different kind of criticism altogether. For Diamond, the notion of moral rights for animals is irrelevant when it comes to explaining the moral acceptability of eating animals because we make decisions in other spheres of life that eating certain entities is unacceptable without any associated talk of rights. Specifically, Diamond suggests that our aversion to eating the human dead is not based on the moral right of the dead body not to be eaten, but because we feel uncomfortable at the very mention of the possibility of consuming human dead bodies, or amputated human limbs. This uncomfortableness is explained not by talk of rights, but by the idea that a person is not something to eat. This is a thought that comes about because of the nature of our interactions with human beings and human body parts in our lives. Extending this line of thinking to the issue of eating animals, Diamond takes issue with the following line of argument. If you would not eat human beings and you would not eat your pets, then you should not eat other animals, at least higher primates, perhaps, because there is no meaningful difference between such animals and things that you would not eat. For Diamond, such an argument is extremely unpersuasive. This is because it misses, in its cold and logical form, the fact that pets, like dead human bodies and amputated human limbs, are also not things to be eaten. As Diamond says, pets are given names, we let them into our houses and we interact with them in ways that we do not with wild animals. Wild animals may be things to eat, just as a chicken on display in a supermarket is something for me to eat, whereas my own chickens in the garden are not. This approach may be appealing to a non-cognitivist, anti-realist interpretation of moral thought and moral talk. These theories are explained in Chapter 6. We might wonder if the cries of the campaigner regarding the moral status of certain animals as things not to eat are designed to pick up on genuinely existing moral properties in the world as the cognitivist or realist would like, or whether these calls reflect a non-cognitivist, perhaps an emotivist style, attitude. However, Diamond herself holds a vegetarian position that she thinks can be advanced, not by cold and logical arguments as previously identified, and not by talk of moral rights, but by reshaping our relationship with animals to add to the list of things not to be eaten. To this end, Diamond offers a Janeleg poem, Learning to be a Dutiful Carnivore, as an exemplar of tactics that may be far more effective for securing movements towards vegetarianism. Dogs and cats and goats and cows. Ducks and chickens, sheep and sows. Woven into tales for tots. Pictured on their walls and pots. Time for dinner. Come and eat all your lovely, juicy meat. One day ham from Percy Porker. In the comics he's a corker. Then the breast from Mrs. Cluck. Or the wing from Donald Duck. Liver next from Clara Cow. No, it doesn't hurt her now. Yes, that leg's from Peter Rabbit. Chew it well, make that a habit. Eat the creatures killed for sale. But never pull the pussy's tail. Eat the flesh from filthy hogs. But never be unkind to dogs. Grow up into doublethink. Kiss the hamster, skin the mink. Never think of slaughter, dear. That's why animals are here. They only come on Earth to die. So eat your meat, and don't ask why. This poem, says Diamond, does not preach a form of behavior but instead challenges assumed beliefs regarding which animals are acceptable sources of food and which are not. If we view animals as fellow creatures rather than as objects for consumption, then we may change our relationship with them such that killing and eating them will seem as out of bounds as consuming a dead human being. Cannibalism is not always viewed as being morally wrong, of course, as difficult situations will change our perspective. Most of the time, however, we recoil at this possible act without the need for formal utilitarian or Kantian justifications. Diamond's paper is worth your careful attention, and she responds to a challenge that her line of argument opposing unethical treatment of animals might create unfortunate analogies with ways in which we should oppose sexism and racism. In cases of sexism and racism, we might hope that moral rights justify fair and equal treatment, rather than the mere fact that we might happen to see people as fellow creatures, a fact that appears to depend on us, and not the person who should have the moral right. We might suggest that our recoiling at racial discrimination follows from the moral right a person has, not that our recoiling is what makes such discrimination morally wrong. Whether you find Diamond's approach compelling or not matters more, in all likelihood, than whether you agree with her conclusions. If her method is sound, then does this show a weakness in the approaches of the normative theories based on reference to rights or duties? 9. Summary. As our text concludes, few moral theorists will claim that eating animals is absolutely and completely acceptable in all circumstances and at all times. Even Kant recoiled at the idea of cruelty to animals in spite of his express denial that humans possess any duty towards animals. This fact suggests that conclusions regarding the ethical acceptability of eating animals may often be determined by empirical and real-world data regarding the preferences, pains, or pleasures of animals and the impact of the processes of rearing and then slaughtering animals for human consumption. The real-world situation is constantly in flux, but this chapter should provide you with a moral framework into which real-world research can be plugged, in order to explain the different key theories, as well as coming to your own viewpoint. 10. Questions and tasks. As we've reached the end of our course of study, you will not be held accountable for answering these specific questions for course credit. However, all of the questions asked throughout this chapter and the 6 questions asked in the Issues to Consider section will benefit you in your continued development of moral reasoning and in your use of the presented ethical lenses. 11. Course conclusion. I sincerely hope you continue your use of these ethical lenses and attempt to answer, for yourself, the mountains of questions left for us by our text. Indeed, developing ourselves as moral and ethical human beings is one of the best things we can do for ourselves, our communities, and the world in general. Imagine if everyone had a vested interest in discovering moral truth and rationally working through issues. The world would likely be a better place if more people studied ethics and philosophy in general. As a 16-week semester limits us in the number of applied ethical topics we can consider, it would also be beneficial to view other contemporary moral problems you are interested in, through the ethical lenses presented in this course. Perhaps you may want to look at the moral question of abortion through the Kantian ethical lens, or the question of cheating through the Aristotelian ethical lens, or questions of transgender rights through utilitarian ethical lenses. If nothing else, perhaps you will be able to clarify to yourself what makes the acts that you consider moral and immoral so characterized. Whether you take philosophy with you, or not, please remember, we make the world what it is, and I hope you leave this course with a desire to make it a good one. So long and good luck.